started. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I know that it's not the warmest evening out there, so I appreciate you coming out in the cold. Welcome to the Island Lecture Series, a program of the Institute of Island Studies that's been running on and off since the 1980s, so that's a pretty incredible legacy. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, who have called this island home for over 12,000 years. And as a recent settler to Epiquid, I'd like to express my gratitude for the Mi'kmaq history, culture, and stewardship, and also to all the elders, past, present, and future. Malauio. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bren Simmers. I'm managing editor of Island Studies Press, which is the publishing arm of the Institute. And the Institute's located just down the hall on the way to the washrooms. You might have seen some of our news clippings and everything island related. The Institute is a public policy research and education institute, and we have just celebrated our 40th anniversary. 40,
41.
Yeah, 41. I know. It's just, I'm looking at you like, did I get that right? Sometimes you add extra years, but 44 years, which is a long time. So if you're interested in what we're doing, you can check out our social media accounts or look us up at islandstudies.com. Very easy to remember web address. We also have this wonderful board. Some of you might be like, what is she doing holding this flag? This is our Island Studies newsletter sign-up sheet. And we send out a monthly newsletter that talks about all things island, calls for conferences and papers, fun videos, island news, so you can sign up for that. And I promise we won't share your email with anyone else. And tonight, we are in for a real treat because the Island Lecture Series presents a talk by our very own Andrew Halliday called Borders, Boundaries, and Jurisdictional Islanding, Placemaking in Atlantic Canada during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think we're far enough from the pandemic we can actually talk about it now, so this is really exciting. And does anyone here not know Andrew? Just curious. Has anyone not met Andrew? Okay, fabulous. This is wonderful. Andrew is a cross-appointed graduate faculty in Island Studies and Cleantech here at P.E.I, and he is working in interdisciplinary graduate programs, and he's an interdisciplinary scholar, so he's a great fit. And he also has a lot of academic and public service background, having worked for the Government of P.E.I, the Government of Alberta, and Government of Canada. So we're really lucky to have you. Thank you so much. Please welcome Andrew Halliday.
Thanks so much, Bren. And I'll just echo Brendan saying thank you so much for joining us here this evening. I'm going to try using not the microphone, so if folks do need me to use the microphone at the back, if you can't hear me, please just put your hand up or let me know. But it's my pleasure to be here this evening with you for our last Island Studies lecture of the season, and talking, as Bren mentioned, about borders, boundaries, and jurisdictional islanding. And so this idea of placemaking in Atlantic Canada during the COVID-19 pandemic. This event this evening is also held in conjunction with the International Geographical Union's Geo Night event, which is in the middle of April, and that is through the Commission on Islands, which is a group of scholars from around the world who are interested in studying islands as distinct geographical phenomena and in exploring their significance in the context of issues concerning global change, sustainability and resilience research, cultural geography and humanities, political and economic geography, and other key aspects of development. And so tonight, in talking about placemaking and talking about these ideas of boundaries and borders, we're going to be moving into both geographic islands, as represented by the image on the left-hand side of my slide here, as well as non-geographic islands. And so those are items, as the Google definition suggests, that resemble an island, especially in either being isolated, being detached, or being surrounded in some way. And so we'll get into that a little bit later here. But the exemplar example that I want to talk about in the context of some of my doctoral research that I just recently completed is the Atlantic bubble. And as Bren said, perhaps we are now far enough away in 2026 to maybe reflect back on those early months of the initial waves of the pandemic in Atlantic Canada back in 2020. And so the Atlantic bubble, as defined and outlined in pink here on the slide, is a subnational policy construct which involved the 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador. And I argue it is a COVID archipelago as a non-geographic jurisdictional islanded construct, which occurred at the subnational level in the eastern part of Canada between July and November of 2020. So what are COVID islands and COVID archipelagos, you may ask? So COVID islands and COVID archipelagos can be explained as policy constructs that occurred at both the micro and the macro level during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so these differences in spatial scales are used to distinguish and describe the interactions and the insular processes which took place. And so I define a COVID island as a definitive social cultural policy construct of an islanded household or a jurisdiction, so a micro or a macro level COVID island with very distinct spatial, temporal, and social boundaries during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in order to have a COVID archipelago, which an archipelago is defined as a group of islands, you need a group of these COVID islands coming together to make up that archipelagic construct. And the insular construction and the imagery of such COVID islands arose from the social and the physical distancing enforced in many jurisdictions as a policy response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which sought to limit disease transmission. And they were quite prolific at the micro level, as many households were encouraged in many different jurisdictions to try and limit social contacts, and various regimes of isolation and quarantine were enacted. And in this way, a process of islanding within individual networks actually did occur. And so to draw a few parallels into the island studies literature in relation to this idea of COVID islands and COVID archipelagos, there's a few pieces of literature I just want to walk everyone through that really kind of speak to this idea of non-geographic islands. And so this idea, and I should say island studies as an interdisciplinary field of inquiry, draws upon a number of different discipline domains. So I'm a social scientist by background, a political scientist, but this literature draws from sociology, this literature draws from literature, it also draws from anthropology, as well as some core island studies literature as well. And so in understanding this idea of non-geographic island constructs and the idea of jurisdictional islanding, we can look at something like this concept of social islands, which Pitt brought forward all the way back in 1980. And so Pitt was a sociologist talking about relatively small groups of people who were considering themselves as separate from other groups, so having clear social boundaries, both horizontally and vertically in the social structure, and also usually being discrete in space and time. So having spatial and temporal distance in relation to that, or being defined by space and time. John Gillis also spoke of the idea of cultural islands and islanding in the early 2000s. And then Siwa in the Shima Journal spoke of the concept of Shima, which is a Japanese term which embodies a dual meaning as islands as geographic features, as well as islands as small-scale social groups where cultural interactions are densely intermeshed. And so Siwa suggested the construction of a Shima is a work of territorial imagination and an extension of personhood in a cultural landscape. Lisa Fletcher from Australia in 2011 spoke of performative geography in understanding an island space as one being something that is culturally produced, that is neither privileging geography or literature, but insists on their interconnection. And so the understanding of considering islands as a productivity of individual and social identities. So how that island identity really comes into the fore in these locations and in these places and spaces that may not be true geographic islands as per the geographic definition. Alongside these concepts, there are a few other important concepts that kind of shape this thinking and help to shape my own thinking in this project. In the field of island studies, there's been a lot of discussion, and there was a turn in the literature in the early 2010s speaking about archipelagic thinking and thinking with the archipelago. And so that is to say, if there are numerous islands that are together in an archipelagic structure, how do those island-to-island relations take place, and how are they constructed through those individual relationships? And so the archipelagic ideal is conceived as a set of relations that articulates cultural and political formations, models of interpreting and inhabiting the world, and also symbolic imaginaries. Alongside that, Karen Olwig and Jenkins in 2014 spoke of this idea of island identity and the idea of social constructionism. So groups are real if people think they are real, and in the ways they behave, and in the way that they construct that reality. So they actually realize it and they believe it. And I think that that's an important consideration as we talk about this idea of a COVID archipelago as a non-geographic islanded construct. Phil Hayward in 2016 spoke of almost islands with islandish identities that have marine spaces that border them, and they have a sense of islandness, he argues, resulting either from differences in adjacent locales or impediments to easy intercourse with them. So in that way, Phil Hayward is saying that islands are relational to other spaces and other places around them. And lastly, in 2021, there was this concept put forward of island imaginaries, and how the physical and the metaphorical properties of islands are mutually constituted. And so all this aforementioned literature speaks to this building body of literature in island studies and some of the other related disciplines around questions of island composition, island attributes, and islandness itself as a concept. And this exemplifies that emerging understandings are going beyond islands simply as pure geographic constructs or pure geographic islands in that sense. As we think about borders and boundaries, which was the top line of our title, which you all came here for this evening, when we think about that in the context of jurisdictional islanding and also what took place in the summer of 2020, you can see the sign behind you on the slide here. This one's not up in Borden anymore, but it used to say, "Welcome to P.E.I. Your vacation starts here," right? Is that geographically accurate? Perhaps not. But when we talk about borders and boundaries, again, to wrap it in the field of island studies, Godfrey Baldacchino, who some of you in the room may know, a friend of our program and a former faculty member here at UPEI, Baldacchino, in his original World of Islands reader in 2007, stated that island studies is very much about the implications of permeable borders. And so what does that mean for islands in relation to that? And so I build upon this, again, in the consideration and the contemplation of these ideas of non-geographic islands also tying in. And so when we consider boundaries and borders, I'll move into the sociology literature a little bit here, but George Simmel, a very seminal sociologist, spoke about the fact that borders and boundaries, actually two basically mirroring quotes here, but borders and boundaries are not spatial facts with sociological consequences, but rather the sociological fact that forms itself spatially. And so in and of that, when you think about how borders are constructed and what meaning they bring and how they define not only the space they're bordering, but also the subsequent spaces around it, it's interesting to contemplate how that defines that space and what meaning that provides. And so Cambridge Dictionary defines a boundary as a real or imagined line that marks the edge or the limit of something. And so while a boundary is afforded this imaginary domain, a border remains in reality and is seemingly much more firmer for it. So in understanding the difference between boundaries and borders and what that means going forward. And so Simmel again says the processes of spatial boundaries have their roots in the psychological forces of the soul by which people in a given territory hold together in a geographical space. So again, the border is providing a structure and providing a meaning socially and culturally for people that are actually constrained or encompassed within that space. And also, Passy in 2012 spoke of this idea of borders being constituted and constructed of production and reproduction of territories. And so borders are, they suggest, dispersed sets of power relations that are mobilized for various purposes. So borders are always there, but it's how they are being constructed and reconstructed, how they're being employed and utilized really gives that meaning and that appreciation to a border in that context. And so when we think of Prince Edward Island, what does this mean for PEI? What borders and boundaries are we familiar with here in our own islanded context? There are lots of boundaries and borders that we have in PEI that are not really well defined or really well agreed upon. Up west, West Prince, East Prince, down east, up east, out east, the North Shore, the South Shore, the list goes on, but how do we actually delineate and define those areas that we're providing meaning towards? And where are those boundaries and those borders found on this map of Prince Edward Island, right? It's interesting because there was some media coverage on this a couple of years ago, and they asked Ed McDonald, a colleague of ours, where East Prince ended and where West Prince began. And Ed gave his answer with the very clear caveat that he was from down east. So he wasn't from the west, but he thought it ended and started in this geographic location. And then other folks from up west disagreed with him and said it was a few kilometers up the road, right? But how does that really align with what we understand? And so how about some examples of borders and boundaries that we are familiar with in a PEI context, right? So there's a couple of different sets here. These should be familiar to some folks in the room. On the far left-hand side, you have the old lot system, as well as the counties and the royalties, the provincial the county capitals that were in place on this map here on the far left-hand side. In the center is, of course, our employment insurance zones. We went to 2 zones, the capital city and close by, and then everyone else. And then on the right-hand side, you have the municipal boundaries in Prince Edward Island, showing the various municipalities as well. So all examples of boundaries and borders that are statutorily driven here in PEI. A few more examples, of course, on the right-hand side of my slide here. You have the electoral boundaries map provincially, 27 provincial electoral districts, and then you also have the electoral zones for the public schools branch as well. But on the left is the other one that I want to raise your attention to and is interesting in the context of our topic here this evening. This is the delimitation lines as laid out in the 1964 Interprovincial Boundary Agreement that took place between the federal government and the provinces of PEI, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, and Quebec in trying to delineate the Gulf of St. Lawrence with respect to the Ile de Magellan, which is right there. And so I'll show you a little zoomed in image here of it on the left, but this is just the island studies scholar and the nostalgist in me reminding you all that PEI as an island actually has maritime borders, right? Those are them right there. And then in relation to the idea of these maritime borders, on the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an image from the Federal Treasury Board Secretariat. That is the Confederation Bridge, and the parcel numbers that you see are associated with the New Brunswick parcel, and then the PEI parcel, which for some reason is broken into 3 different parcels. But notwithstanding that, the boundary of the 2 provinces and the border of the 2 provinces is found right in the middle of the bridge. However, you never see that demarcated when you go across the bridge. There's no tiny little set of flags halfway across the bridge that says you're leaving PEI and you're entering New Brunswick or vice versa, right? So, needless to say, the maritime boundaries, while real and being borders in effect, lent themselves to more terrestrial, more land-based bordering efforts during the COVID-19 pandemic, which we'll see here in a second. And so, in considering this idea of hardening of provincial borders, or this idea of jurisdictional islanding, also was referred to in 2020 as jurisdictional coupling, as folks struggled with language to try to explain what was actually taking place from a public policy perspective. But again, you can see in the image in the slide behind you, should look a little bit familiar. You've got the RCMP cruiser parked right here, and there is the entrance to the Confederation Bridge on the New Brunswick side of the border, and the board is saying that there is a COVID checkpoint in approximately 14 kilometers. So what did jurisdictional islanding through the practices of hardening of our provincial borders look like in the COVID-19 pandemic? So the 4 provinces in Atlantic Canada, in the initial weeks and months of the COVID-19 pandemic, they engaged in jurisdictional islanding as their chosen pandemic policy response. And so that was the case of 4 provinces hardening their own existing provincial borders. It was quite interesting at the time because, of course, the federal government had kind of stepped in and air travel had quite petered out. And so the 4 Atlantic provinces were looking mainly to their land borders and their major highway borders and trying to harden them to eliminate the transmission of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see on the right there, that was one of the fundraising t-shirts that the Community Foundation did in the midst of the pandemic. Then Transportation Minister Stephen Myers, famously on the one of the COVID update briefings from the province, basically said that we're going to shut the bridge down and we're going to turn your rig right around, so don't even bother coming over, right? Something to that effect. So that was the efforts of the 4 provinces, and PEI was viewed regionally and nationally as being perhaps the most stringent from a border regime in the entire country, and the hardening of our border, right? And it was helped in a way because at that time the ferry was not running yet in the summer months. As I said, the federal government had kind of taken care of air travel, so air travel was at a bare minimum. And so PEI, as an island jurisdiction, a true geographic island jurisdiction, only had a bridge connection to worry about. And so government of the day, through their various chosen policy instruments, enacted a policy regime to be able to deal with the hardening of our provincial border. And so that was done through instruments such as public health orders under the Public Health Act, and also states of emergency being issued under the Emergencies Act. And actually at the time, PEI was one of the few provinces that had to use both of those policy instruments, because the Emergency Act actually dealt with the border, while the Public Health Act dealt with the public health crisis and pandemic that was in place. And so in shaping that policy response and in that jurisdictional hardening, again, as I said, all 4 provinces were engaged in that to a certain extent, dealing with that initial wave of the pandemic. As we think about these jurisdictions self-islanding themselves, we have to think about the social and the cultural impacts and responses that went with the COVID-19 pandemic as well. And so there was bad with the good in the creation of these jurisdictional islands. And so there was a lot of individual and collective pressure and responsibility in trying to maintain this new normal and see off any threats to this new islanded lifestyle. And so these examples on the slide all took place in late May, June 2020, prior to the opening of the Atlantic bubble. But if you recall, there were instances, quite a few instances of plate shaming that went on in PEI. There were an example of a veterinary student here at the vet college who had provincial plates in Charlottetown whose car got keyed, and a rather direct note was left on her car, and at one point I think she put a note in her own windshield to say, "I've been here for a year and a half, please don't damage my car." But this is what took place, and also you also had examples of, at one point the government set up a hotline to try and make sure people were adhering to policy measures and the policy responses, right? So all of these impacts on this islanded identity that was in place, and this new norm that we were able to create and establish, really lent itself to, again, the social and cultural pressures that were alongside it as well. So I just wanted to make reference to that as well. So let's talk about the hardening of provincial borders and a few examples that we can point to. So in the midst of my project and through the qualitative data that I assembled in talking to key policy actors across the 4 Atlantic provinces, I'll start with New Brunswick. I have an example from New Brunswick and a couple examples from here in Prince Edward Island. But New Brunswick's response, I was told, was MacGyvered from here to kingdom come. So I think most folks in the room might be familiar with who MacGyver is. Late 1980s, early 1990s television hero. Really resourceful. Now in the dictionary as well, the dictionary defines MacGyver as one who finds a simple yet elegant solution using existing resources. And so what did that mean in the New Brunswick context? That meant that they used Department of Natural Resources officers who were used to monitoring the woods. Everyone was shifted. They borrowed people from all sorts of departments to actually build a border service, which my respondent told me, which was surreal in itself, right? So in practice, this looked like conservation officers, prison wardens, other folks across the government system who had some form of public safety training or some form of law enforcement training to some regard, being deployed on the borders, because all 4 provinces, but particularly PEI and New Brunswick in this case, were basically building border agencies from scratch, right? Because they had hardened the border and they were looking to maintain that hardened border. And so the image there from a CBC article, Coverage in New Brunswick, speaks about forest rangers, commercial vehicle enforcement officers, corrections officers, and other peace officers being on the borders in the New Brunswick context. And in the New Brunswick context, they were doing that through all their major provincial gateways, as I talked about a little bit earlier. So the Trans-Canada Highway access up in Campbellton as well, and then also down to the ferry and the airport in St. John, as well as the borders with Nova Scotia, and then also our border with P.E.I. as well. And so what did this look like in a P.E.I. example when we talk about the hardening of borders? So I had another respondent tell me that in the context of Wood Islands and the ferry to Pictou, Nova Scotia, we had to hire more people to do all the checks and stuff. We set up a brand new base, like at Wood Islands where the ferry comes in. There was a whole village set up to come into. And then I was informed that if you go by today, you'll see the electrical stakes out of the ground. It's bare now, everything is stripped down. And that was in 2023, I believe, that I talked with that particular respondent. So if we look at this from a mapping perspective and kind of look at the visual evidence, if folks are familiar with the way station that was in Wood Islands, just off the ferry, it was there for quite a long time. The provincial government removed it in the mid-2010s and just left kind of a vacant pull-off area. So this is what it looked like in 2019, and then this is what it looked like in 2021 at the height of the pandemic. You can see that there was some building infrastructure put in place. You can see it was freshly paved. You see there's pavement markings for traffic control, and you can see a hub of activity with vehicles and such. So that was kind of the major border checkpoint that was put in place in the southeastern part of P.E.I. to deal with those ferry passengers coming from Nova Scotia and further afield. However, in 2023, you can see it all disappeared again, right? So that is an example again of how P.E.I. sought to harden its border in relation to some of these efforts for jurisdictional islanding that took place. The other example in P.E.I. is obviously the Confederation Bridge, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And so this image on my slide here is from the P.E.I. RCP Twitter account in April 2020. So the pandemic had arrived about 2 weeks earlier, and this is really the first visual evidence that I could find of the efforts to harden our border at our main border access point at that time, and it's right here. So as you can see, there's a couple of concrete road barriers that have been put in place. There's a couple of pickup trucks down here, and that was the first effort to try and put in some form of border control in Borden, Carleton, at the edge of the Confederation Bridge, which you can also see in the distance over here, of course. These efforts to harden the border grew as the pandemic took shape, and also through the various settings of our border regimes, including the Atlantic bubble, which again we'll talk about in a couple of minutes here. And so what did this border grow to look like? This is what it looked like in 2020, with some tents and some more highway barriers and a couple of trades trailers to kind of set up those checkpoints. And then this is what it looked like in 2021. And so you can see that the efforts that the province made to kind of provide a bit of a winterization of the location, also a slight expansion to allow for more traffic, and that was obviously had occurred after the Atlantic bubble in 2020, and then also after the vaccines had come into play, and after there was more intra-provincial mobility that was taking place in that 2021 calendar year. But there was still a desire from a public policy perspective, from the provincial perspective, to try and keep a little bit of monitoring with respect to the travel that was taking place. What does this site look like today, just out of curiosity? There it is in 2023, and there it is in 2025. You can see it's basically been returned back to grass and sod. And I can tell you, I was in Halifax on the weekend, and we drove back on Sunday, and I couldn't tell you where that was up in Borden Carleton today, if you put me on the ground up there. And so, in this, and looking at this idea of hardening of provincial borders and the changing of policy settings, how about this idea of COVID islands and COVID archipelagos that I introduced you to at the start? And so the Atlantic bubble, again, is the example on the slide here, but there are a few other examples that I wanted to just highlight as well that go further and speak a little bit more about this idea of COVID islands and COVID archipelagos. And so on this slide here, you can see efforts to talk about bubbling of households, and so this would be, again, at that micro level, You can see coverage from CBC Toronto, you can see coverage from CNN, and you can also see efforts from Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Labrador talking about how to bubble. And so Newfoundland and Labrador was one of the jurisdictions that allowed for one of these vaunted double bubbles to occur, right? You could get 2 households that could bubble together, but only 2 households and only up to 6 additional people to your own family unit. So all of those examples of these ideas of micro-level COVID islands, as well, it wasn't just left to North America. You have examples from Los Angeles, California, talking about bubbling. You have examples from the NHS in the UK, allowing for a Christmas bubble to take place of up to 3 households. So again, this idea of COVID islands as a conceptual frame has utility beyond just the Atlantic Canadian example and the Atlantic bubble. When we talk about the mediums used to provide the ability for COVID islands to come together, this example here should be quite familiar to a lot of folks and perhaps bring back some memories, good, bad, or otherwise, but this would be an example, I would argue, of a COVID archipelago, where you have all these islands, the individual household islands that were islanded together, and they joined together through a different medium, which is the medium of cyberspace. And so while they were physically islanded and distanced, they were able to connect through cyberspace and through the internet to form this idea of a COVID archipelago. And I know there was examples of lots of folks that were kind of reaching out through their digital networks to try and perhaps provide for that gathering and some of that socializing that couldn't be done in a physical means as well. From a macro level, we talked about the Atlantic bubble. There are a few other examples of different jurisdictions. So there was the Trans-Tasman bubble between Australia and New Zealand that was considered. There is the Baltic bubble between Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania that took place in a continental perspective. And then also the Isle of Guernsey, the bailiwick of Guernsey, tried to do a bit of a bailiwick bubble with their minor islands as well that took place. Interestingly enough, they chose that path forward during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Isle of Jersey, which is the other Channel Island, which is over here somewhere, they chose to connect with and kind of bubble with the UK mainland, as opposed to going with the other bailiwicks in the Channel Islands, just off the coast of France. So, when we look at the Atlantic bubble, we talk about this idea of jurisdictional islanding. This was an example where the 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces decided to move from 4 separate islanded structures into more of a uniform regional response. And I would say at the outset of my research, I was seemingly of the belief that it was rather uniform in its construction, and I can say through my research I came to realize that the uniformity was perhaps projected to the public and projected outward, but in reality this was 4 provinces doing 4 of their own guided policy responses. There was agreement on a risk threshold and a risk level to undertake, but they really were doing it on their own themselves. And so it was a COVID archipelago in the way that the 4 COVID islands came together in that archipelagic construction, but very much maintained their own jurisdiction and autonomy in their policy efforts. And so what I would say about the Atlantic bubble is I would say that it was defined quite temporally. So from a time perspective, this orange box here represents the Atlantic bubble, and so you can see it was in operation from about the 3rd or 4th of July all the way through to the last week of November. And so it was defined temporally in the fact that it existed for a very definitive set amount of time, and of course it burst, if folks remember, owing to the epidemiology that was taking place in the mainland provinces of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. The 2 true geographic island provinces of P.E.I. and Newfoundland and Labrador decided that that risk level was too high for them, and they exited this COVID archipelago construction and removed themselves from the Atlantic bubble. It was also defined spatially. As you saw this image on my earlier slides, it was defined spatially in the sense that there was a perimeter that was put in place to try and provide an outward border for the 4 Atlantic provinces in order to allow for that non-quarantine intra-region travel. And really, the whole key to the Atlantic bubble from a geographic perspective is the role of New Brunswick in being that stopper in the bottle, as was explained to me by one of my respondents. And so New Brunswick had to hold that northern border that includes the major highway connection to Quebec City and onward to Montreal, as well as the Campbellton area that I spoke about a little bit earlier. They had to hold that border hard for the sake of the rest of the Atlantic Bubble provinces, right? That was the major threat for importation of virus. And so the Atlantic Bubble would operate in reality until such time that either New Brunswick failed to hold the border, or as what happened, the level of cases that imported into this created place reached a point that other provinces were not comfortable with it. So it was defined spatially as well as being defined temporally. And so, again, my respondents told me that the hottest consideration was that interprovincial border between Quebec and New Brunswick. New Brunswick had to manage the outside world, and the one land border that everyone was collectively worried about was northeastern New Brunswick. Without it, the Atlantic Bubble would have never worked. The interesting thing about the Atlantic Bubble, again, from a border perspective, is the fact that there were several nuanced cases in place that, again, were symptoms of the realities of it being 4 separate policy responses by the 4 Atlantic Canadian provinces. And so in all of these cases where you see, this was areas where bordering communities in the other provinces outside of the bubble basically shared a border with a community on the Atlantic Bubble side of things. And so in these instances, these communities basically required upon the services and the infrastructure of the community inside the Atlantic Bubble, and predominantly with them being mainly Quebec communities. Each of the provinces actually worked with Quebec. The example here, like with Labrador City and Fairmont, Quebec, basically these Quebec communities, and also on the northern border with New Brunswick, those Quebec communities basically joined the Atlantic Bubble and extended the perimeter and shut the rest of the Quebec province out so they could remain in. Something that wasn't necessarily well advertised or well described during the operation of the bubble, but that led itself to the challenges such as the ferry between the island of Newfoundland and Labrador actually lands in Quebec, in a Quebec community. And so that community, they basically had to let them get off the ferry and keep going and not get out of their vehicle. The Ile de Magdalene, as folks might remember, was quite interesting because Quebec had to negotiate with New Brunswick and P.E.I. to find an arrangement for basically a border corridor to let folks get all the way to Surrey, P.E.I. to catch their ferry. And so New Brunswick and P.E.I. found a uniform treatment for that. Don't leave your vehicle, you're not allowed to stop for food, you're not allowed to stop for washer breaks, basically drive straight through to Surrey, and then once you get into that ferry terminal, then you can basically deal with what you need to deal with, right? They were allowed to stop for gas, and that was about it. But all of these border arrangements, as was suggested by one of my respondents, it was hard to do, and it had holes in it both internally and around the perimeter. But I would suggest they weren't necessarily holes, but rather localized extensions that were negotiated for the bubble. And so these nuanced arrangements structured with the bordering province and allowed for these communities to kind of join the bubble, perhaps quietly and not necessarily fully advertised outside of that province at the time. The other interesting point from a bordering perspective is that those communities weren't the only ones that were interested in joining our bubble. In 2020, the Northwest Territories actually reached out and sought to join the Atlantic Bubble in the fall after the bubble had come into operation in July. That response, or that outreach, was not really entertained by the Atlantic provinces. They said thank you for your interest, but they didn't really go too far on that. As well, the following summer, when the discussions of the second bubble, Bubble 2.0, were taking place, which in the end didn't actually occur, the French Overseas Territory of St. Pierre and Miquelon, which sits just off the coast of the island of Newfoundland, they requested through the Newfoundland government and then onward to the Prime Minister to let them join the bubble as well. Another request that was not acted upon because, if you remember, in the second summer of 2021, we didn't actually have a second bubble, right? The pandemic had moved on, the vaccines had become available, and so the ability for jurisdictional islanding, that shared policy kind of arrangement, was not going to end up coming into place. So lastly, when we talk about placemaking and islanded identity, what does this Atlantic Bubble example as a COVID archipelago tell us, and how did this placemaking kind of occur and take place? I want to note that the bubble was never really called the Atlantic Bubble. The Council of Atlantic Premiers, when they issued their press release on June 24th, called it a travel bubble. The media coverage said they're looking to form this regional bubble this summer.
And as one of my respondents told me, the bubble was a term that was created by the media. So this idea of the bubble, the Atlantic bubble as a place, as a brand, giving meaning to this islanded imaginary and creation, really stemmed from the fact that it helped to pull social cohesion inside the bubble and give meaning to this idea of this social spatial policy construct as an archipelagic island imaginary, right? So the bubble became more than a place, or more of a place, excuse me, rather than a space. And so it was defined spatially as well as temporally, as I said, through the perimeter and also through the announced start date and its operations. But then the social culture of togetherness and islandness really came to the fore with respect to this COVID archipelago. And in that, how do we perceive ourselves and how are we perceived from the outside? It's the relational aspects of the bubble. And so Simmel uses an analogy of a picture frame as a border between the picture that is framed and also the rest of the space in the room that it's breaking it off from. And so in this analogy, the border between social groups closes off and self-contains this islanding construct. And so during the new normal in the pandemic, this effort to create an islanded identity really became, in part, I would argue, providing an islanded identity to those mainland residents of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Labrador in becoming islanders for that period from July to November. It was a place that had meaning. It was a place that was defined again from the outside. So the cartoon says, how do we become a have-not province with folks from Ontario? You can see the Ontario Trillium right there on the briefcase, and the bottom newspaper saying that Atlantic bubble is still COVID-free. And then also Deadder's cartoon in the Halifax Chronicle Herald at the time, showing everyone inside the bubble enjoying the new normal, while those on the outside are left to kind of feel excluded and left on the outside, right? But I think the importance of that is the fact that the bubble and its success was really the success of the population of the people in understanding that they had to follow those regimes and to be part of that creation, because they knew if it was not to succeed, what we would have to go back to, which was back to quarantine travel, back to isolation regimes, and those kind of policy settings that were in place prior to the bubble coming in. And so what are the takeaways in this? So this talk really advances an understanding of the temporal period defined by an external shock of a worldwide pandemic in which jurisdictional islanding occurred and islanded identities were established. And so COVID islands and COVID archipelagos are defined by their relativity to other places, their spatial and temporal aspects, their social construction, and the permeability and the interaction with their borders or defined boundaries that were in place. Such islanding constructions provided an islanded sense of identities for those within the boundaries, affording a regime of apparent self-containment and attaching ideals of islandness as shaped and impacted by this spatial temporal existence. And so the hardening of subnational boundaries into firm borders provided the boundedness necessary to invoke such an understanding. So I will leave it there, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Questions, comments? Anyone have one of those t-shirts?
Could you explain again what happened with the request from St. Pierre Miquelon?
Sure, Mike. So St. Pierre Miquelon reached out in 2021. I think I can find it here. So they reached out in 2021. You can see the article here that was actually in the National Post. And so St. Pierre Miquelon, as a French overseas territory, had spent the first Atlantic bubble summer being on the outside. And so they were, in the words of someone that was quoting the article, they were stuck on their islands and they were unable to get into that bubble and to do any traveling. They weren't permitted to go to Newfoundland and Labrador because it was an international border. And so in that, it was a journalist in the jurisdiction that was actually quoted in the National Post quite extensively, and he basically made the point that their islands had become too small and they needed that release. They needed to get out. They needed to be part of the Atlantic bubble. But again, because it was an international border, it wasn't a decision for the provincial government of Newfoundland and Labrador nor one that could be taken to the Council of Atlantic Premiers for discussion, right? At that time and place, the international borders were still fairly heavily restricted, and they were the purview of the Government of Canada. And so it was the prefect of St. Pierre-Miquelon wrote to the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, which I believe was still Fury at the time, and then as well they ended up writing to the Prime Minister. But as I said, because it was the summer of 2021, in reality, when the Atlantic provinces began to discuss a bubble, so much had moved with respect to vaccines being available. There were new personalities and new faces at the Premier's tables. Premier Rankin had come in Nova Scotia in place of Premier McNeil, and Premier Fury had come into Newfoundland and Labrador in place of Premier Ball. And so in the end, the four provinces weren't able to find consensus. There was also a push from provinces like New Brunswick were quite eager to open up to the rest of the country. And so in the end, it just was a moot point. And then I don't believe the federal borders changed until maybe the late fall of 2021. But.
So for a year or for even longer, how were they getting supplied by air? Or could a ship come up to St. Lawrence into the Gulf and go to the...
So they have fairly significant air links with Paris, I think, with Air France, but they do get a lot of supplies from Newfoundland and Labrador. I think it's quite plausible that the supplies might have still been crossing the narrows there between Newfoundland and St. Pierre-Miquelon. So I think the combination of that, along with their traditional economy and the fact that most of their supplies are coming in from the French mainland, I think they were able to survive in that regard. I think it was more so perhaps the mental health and the societal pressures of being kind of, in some of their eyes, and being basically prisoners of their own islands, right? Josh?
Great talk, thanks. Something I didn't hear you mention was the kind of medical effects of transmission, infection, and spread. And I know health professionals and scientists looked into like the effect of islandness on that, and I was wondering if you've incorporated that into your research. Oh. Did I miss that slide?
No, so this is the total case count number, but I think it's interesting because I have a bit of a divided perspective on that, because I was in government at the time at the provincial level as well, and I can recollect in the conversations that were happening, there was an appreciation and awareness of the main determining factor was the capacity within the healthcare system, right? And so P.E.I. at the time, I think, had 12 ICU beds or something like that, I believe. And then the other big question at the time, if you think back, was the idea of respirators and how many respirators you have, where are they located, what's available, those kind of things. And so P.E.I., the leadership shown by Dr. Heather Morrison as the Chief Public Health Officer, P.E.I. was very cognizant of the structures and the shortcomings of their healthcare system. And so in that, the true geographic island that we are, I think that's why they were so aggressive in being the first and the main province to be shutting down their borders and hardening the borders so significantly just in the midst of the first wave of that pandemic, right? Because as you can see, PEI is the yellow line, and we had some cases that started, but certainly not to the level of Newfoundland, which again had that initial spike in the funeral home case where they had the funeral, and it was quite significant, and then also Nova Scotia with respect to what was happening in some of their long-term care facilities as well too, right? So we certainly weren't able to completely stop the transmission of the virus into the jurisdiction, but at the time I think the epidemiologists were speaking of the N number, which is the transmission rate, and I think they were wanting to keep it below 1.6 or something like that, which is less than 2 people per infection when the host kind of passes it on, right? So
there have been other studies then to compare like other islands like Hong Kong, or with massive population, but also probably very big capacity. Like the real issue was, a lot of the issue was healthcare capacity.
yeah, well, and islands were true because of and that's funny because islandness and the idea of these jurisdictional islanding, like the true geographic islands were really the exemplars of the pandemic, right? You can think of a lot of those islands in the South Pacific that never got a single COVID case into their jurisdiction, and so there has been some research and some literature looking at this idea of splendid isolation and the fact that islands became those ideals that folks aspire to because they were able to limit the transmission of the virus into their jurisdiction. And I think PEI was in a unique case because, again, we only had the singular bridge access point. It probably would have been interesting if we had a year-round ferry instead of a bridge. What that would have meant and how we would have managed that might have been a little bit different. And then the other thing, of course, was PEI being part of Canada, being in the developed country, of course, had access to vaccine supply much earlier than a lot of those other small and developing states or other island jurisdictions. And so that changed for us more quickly than it did for a lot of those other islands as well. So, yes, in the back.
Andrew, so I was just thinking, I recall going to the Islanders hockey games and you had to show your proof that you had been inoculated or whatever, and you had to sit apart. They put dividers up through the stands and that, and so in essence, I guess my issue, and I think you may have answered it, was that because of this controls at the border, it helped us very much, right? And so the second part of my question is, would we do it again?
Well, I think in the example of the Quebec Major Junior Hockey League and the hockey that was taking place there, I think the Maritime provinces were the only teams that were able actually to complete that season in 2020, if I remember correctly. Most of the Quebec teams didn't actually take part in it, but would we do it again? I think in the interviews that I done during this project, in speaking with the key policy actors, so elected officials as well as senior public servants across the 4 provinces, there was COVID was a forced requirement for cooperation on all 4 governments. And so the threat of the unknown and the fact that it was the first wave of the pandemic into the summer of 2020 lent itself to more togetherness and more willingness to kind of collaborate and work together. And you can see that in the fact that the following summer in 2021, when those variables changed and when the vaccines were more readily available, they weren't able to find that consensus and they weren't able to bubble again, despite efforts to do so and despite all the best of intentions, right? So I think as folks told me during some of those interviews, I think the Atlantic bubble as a policy response really fit the time, but I also would argue, based on some of the other examples that I've shown, that using COVID islands and COVID archipelagos as a theoretical lens to understand islandness and to understand non-geographic island constructs, I think can be done in other jurisdictions, other contexts as well. So I think there are still avenues for research from this perspective going forward. So. Nigel?
Following up on that question about would we do it again? During the pandemic, I continue to work in the provincial government. I claim no responsibility for any of this. But I do think PEI and the Atlantic bubble was a tremendous success. Perhaps unrecognized outside of this place. But hearing the question, would we do it again? Only if we remember the lessons learned of what a successful policy execution looks like. And I think we nailed it. Like, it's not just the government, the leadership, society, and the willingness of people to tolerate some fairly restrictive impositions on them to do things that they, or be restricted from doing things that they naturally want to do. So we have to remember this experience.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Nigel. I was talking to one of my respondents and talking about the importance and the role of the Council of Atlantic Premiers as a regional intergovernmental institution that really has that convening function. They don't have any other function. They have some permanent staff, but they're really that policy venue or that policy arena or that table to allow those conversations to take place. And I was speaking to this person, and they're very thoughtful, and they said, our institutions are only as good as those that come after, right? To your point as well. So it really comes down to the people that are in those positions of power, elected and unelected, and again, it comes down to the social cultural aspect of the society and how they're willing to bend. I think part of that was reflected in the fact that some folks maybe hinted at the fact that the compliant nature of Atlantic Canadians meant that they could do it. They could get away with it in this first summer of the pandemic, right? Because people were willing to be compliant, people still had trust in their governments, trust in their institutions, and really thought that they were having their best interests at heart and at the core. And I think part of that was maybe reflected in the fact that in this province and some of the other provinces, the chief public health officer really became that honest broker that really led the public face of the response, right? And I think that was a deliberate choice by the leadership of the day to really let them be the public face of it, to try and remove that political aspect from it and really say this is being led by the epidemiology and the evidence, this is being led by what science is telling us, and this isn't necessarily being driven by other motivations, political or otherwise, right? So I think that's an important consideration in that context too.
That was really the case for the first year, but then things started.
Yeah, for sure. Right.
So I wonder if that's because of the outside threat, you know, it was so massive in the beginning and it was so unknown in that 2020, and then next year we kind of became more knowledgeable about it. And I've lived in practically every province in Canada, and I think that Atlantic Canada is special, and that there's something really distinctive about the way we treat one another and our value system that doesn't show up in any other place except maybe Saskatchewan. And I think it has to do with generalized reciprocity, where you really care for people and you don't expect to get something back. And so that's why I say our islandness, which islandness is, that's what it is our superpower. And we need to make more of it. And so back there, Nigel, yes, we do need to tell this story more. So thank you for doing it, Andrew.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that. So the editorial cartoons were quite powerful in the region throughout the pandemic. So this was one that I like to show, because this shows the editorial response, the editorial cartoon response to what was happening in real time during the bubble. And so this is when the mainland cases started to spike, and these were the two major cartoons that the Adder ran in the Halifax Chronicle Herald. That one looks, of course, very similar to the one I showed you a little bit earlier. And then you've got the 4 provinces in the elevator, and New Brunswick starts coughing, right? And then when the bubble itself actually burst, there was some dialogue between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick that took place, and in the end it was kind of New Brunswick that pulled away from Nova Scotia, fully ending, because New Brunswick and Nova Scotia actually maintained a bit of a border arrangement, a bit of a jurisdictional coupling for a couple of days past when P.E.I. and Newfoundland and Labrador exited the bubble as well. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That's really a great place to end, I think. So, thanks again. As Andrew mentioned, this is the last lecture series, or lecture in our series for this term. We'll begin again in September. I just want to thank you all for coming out, and get home safe. We'll see you again. Yay! That was fantastic, Andrew.